Welcome to the show, everyone. How are you doing today? How is your week so far? It is Tuesday. And today I have a lovely guest I'm very excited about, Mr. Robert Barnes. Robert, welcome to the show. How are you?
Hey, glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks for joining. I'm glad you have a classic cigar. I brought out one of the cigars I've been holding on to. My dad gave me this. This is a genuine Cohiba.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. He said it was like $40. He's like, "Are you gonna smoke this?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm gonna smoke it." Of course, I haven't smoked it yet, but I, you know, I like smelling it.
Oh yeah, that's a nice dark Maduro
Oh,
wrapper.
it's good.
Has a
Yeah.
good rich scent.
Oh, this
That
thing
little
is a beauty.
plastic holder holds it well. Probably what, a Siglo 6, something like that.
Um, Habana, Cuba, Siglo 6, exactly what it is. Yeah, that's
Voila.
there. You know your stuff. Well, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate having you on the show. I've been an admirer from a distance. All the stuff that you do. I mean, we had the pleasure of meeting on stream before, but it's nice to have you join me on my show. Thank you for that.
Oh,
Uh,
absolutely.
yeah, how are you doing? What are you up to right now? What are you
Good,
working
good.
on?
I got my good. Someone made a meme and they stuck my head on Abraham Lincoln Memorial, and
That's
it
great.
says "good" on it, which is great. So it's one of our Viva Barnes Law shirts, which is cool. Viva's making he's got a brand coming out, with the Viva VB brand and all this stuff. So
Nice.
it's gonna be fun.
I like that. I like that. Yeah, you guys have a cool little. Now, do you work professionally together?
I mean, effectively, what is, we got the locals channel, and then we do a Sunday show that's sort of breaking down all the law cases every Sunday at 7 Eastern. And then we do a sidebar every Wednesday at 7 Eastern. Well, that's interviewing a guest of some sort. So, like
Nice.
Jeremy from Geeks and Gamers been on, Ryan from Sports Wars, and Ryan. What's Ryan's official channel name? I'm blanking.
RK Outpost.
That's it. RK. I should remember that. RK
Yeah,
Outpost. So he's been on. Nerdrotic has been on. Jeremy
great.
from the Quartering has been on. We're waiting to get Doomcock has been on,
Cool.
future ruler of Earth. We haven't yet had we're gonna try to get Critical Drinker on, Odin from Odin's Movie Blog.
Mhm.
We've had oh man, Christine Meyer. Am I pronouncing
Oh,
her name right?
Christy Mayer.
Christy Mayer, that's
Yeah,
it.
she's great.
We've interviewed her. So that's from sort of the cultural side. Then a range of sort of eclectic intellectuals whose topics and subject matter I'm interested in, and then a
Nice.
range of political folks. The James O'Keefe,
Mhm.
Jack Posobiec, Mike Cernovich, Michael Malice will be on.
Nice.
Then various candidates: J.D. Vance, Blake Masters, Joe Kent. They've all been on. Then
Awesome.
we'll have some more, as probably Adam Laxalt and some others as we go along. Maybe Kathy Barnett if time avails. But
Now, do you do that on Viva's channel or your channel or locals?
that's on Viva's channel. So
Okay.
Viva's YouTube channel is the primary source for the Sunday show and the Wednesday sidebar show. It's on YouTube and on Rumble, and that's the channels, the shows we do together. Then we have the locals channel, and then Viva, broadcasts throughout the week. He does either little law. He started out doing just trying to figure out a digital space. Like he had an interest in artistic photography,
Mhm.
went to law school, did well, but really didn't enjoy the practice of law. Started having kids, didn't want to be caught up in sort of the corporate rat race.
Mhm.
Uh, so went out on his own, but was trying to bridge into the YouTube social media space, create content creator space, and spent like years just trying to break through, doing videos a day, trying to figure, he was doing karaoke videos,
Yeah.
he had a whole bunch of stuff. And
Yep.
then he discovered that people were really interested in his commentary on the law. And we met when he did a breakdown video of Alex Jones's deposition in one of the Sandy Hook cases.
Mm.
I was defending Alex in that particular deposition, and Viva was the only one to do an informed commentary because the media all hates Jones, so they did hit pieces and
Of course.
smears and misinterpretations of the. And Viva looked at it and was like, "Man, the plaintiff's lawyer's kind of a bad lawyer." He didn't say he was crazy because Viva's diplomatic, very Canadian.
Yeah.
But basically, if you watch it, you're like, "Wow, that plaintiff's lawyer's nuts." And so I reached out to him in that context, and then we, hit it off and decided to do a show together, and that's history.
Well, how long have you been practicing law?
A little over 20 years, so almost quarter of a century.
Wow. Okay.
So been doing it for a while. Started out, I clerked for a Indian tribe when I was in law school, clerked for some plaintiffs' lawyers, clerked for a corporate law firm. Then when I went out, I started work with a street lawyer, very much a guy who took in everything off the street. So a wide range of interesting cases, from civil rights to ERISA arbitrations, from personal injury accidents to workers' comp, from civil
All
to
over the
criminal,
place.
small town to big city.
Wow.
Then went to work with a public interest law firm that was just getting off the ground, suing on predatory lending grounds, going after big banks, exposing the subprime lending problem. More than a half decade before it became public news on Wall Street, and then representing victims of domestic abuse across Southeast Tennessee. And then from there, went to work for one of the top personal injury lawyers in the country out of Wisconsin. And then went to work with a buddy of mine in a boutique law firm doing civil rights, constitutional law, criminal tax defense. And then went out on my own a little more than 10 years ago. Started out in Malibu. I am still back and forth to Malibu, but lived there full time and worked out of there with practice that was kind of nationwide, even international. Moved to Vegas.
When you swap states, do you have to retake the bar? Because each
So
state has its own, right?
yes. So I'm licensed in Wisconsin, Tennessee, and California.
Okay.
A bunch of federal courts, Western District of Texas, and a bunch of other places where I'm a general member and can practice without getting a pro hoc counsel. Otherwise, for all these other cases, you have to appear what's called pro hoc vice. You have to appear for one time only. Sometimes you have to have a local lawyer sort of vouch for you. And so
Mm.
I think I've appeared in a case in almost every state of the union, but I'm only
Wow.
licensed in 3, a member of the U.S. Supreme Court and a bunch of federal appellate courts. So those I don't need anybody, but for certain federal district courts, for a lot of state courts, you have to get permission to appear as an out-of-state lawyer. Sometimes you have to get a local lawyer to be local counsel with you. So like Ron Coleman has been with Harmeet Dillon's firm,
Mhm.
has been local counsel with me on a couple of New York cases. I have a bunch of people who volunteered to be local counsel on the vaccine mandate challenge cases. So we got about half the country covered with local counsel who are helping out on those cases. So
Wow.
it varies, but basically I think it's ridiculous. The law is pretty much the same throughout the United States. Essentially, what these are monopolists, you can tell by where it is. Like some of the states that have the hardest state bars are
Mhm.
like Nevada and Hawaii. It's like, why is that? It's
Yeah.
solely to keep Californians out. They don't want Californians coming to Hawaii. They don't want California lawyers coming to Nevada.
Yeah.
And so they make it as difficult as possible. It's really an artificial, arbitrary barrier, monopolistic practice by the state licensing boards that now people are witnessing how this can be misused and abused for politicized purposes.
Mm.
They've always been misused and abused for politicized purposes. It's just more egregious now than ever before. As the left continues to weaponize
Everything.
these licensing. Yeah, they weaponize everything, and licensing boards are an easy place for them to. I'm just never been. I have a libertarian, quasi-anarchistic position on licensing. I don't think the state should be in the business of telling people what occupation they can and can't do. Have honesty in advertising. Let the public know. Let the people choose who they like and trust. I'm not for licensing lawyers. I'm not for licensing doctors. Now, if you just advertise, so you can say, "Hey, I have 10 years education. So and so over here only has 1 year education." Okay, I as a patient can make a pick, can
Yeah.
choose. But this over licensure, all it does is artificially increase prices, arbitrarily reduce the number of people who can practice their chosen path of profession, and allow the political weaponization by the state to disfavor dissidents from being able to pursue their own occupation.
Wow. Yeah, the more I like realize how broad the left has expanded their power, it's really eye-opening, I mean, I didn't even think about this, what you were just telling me, and it makes sense. It's not a surprise. It's more great. Of course they're taking over anything they can. I mean, we're seeing these DAs along the West Coast, very blue areas, just letting people off. What do you think about that whole Dave Chappelle guy getting some misdemeanors instead of a felony?
It's fascinating how much we're seeing a return of old cycles. So it's really late 60s, early 70s, left prosecutorial policies
Mm,
that, in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a lot of legitimate rights. I disagree with some of my friends on the right. I mean, I believe in Miranda. I believe in all the Constitution, not just the convenient ones. And I believe it should be applied to everybody, not just those we like politically. So
mhm.
I think that bail was wrongfully denied Jeffrey Epstein. I think bail was wrongfully denied Ghislaine Maxwell, just like I believe bail was wrongfully denied the January 6th defendants. The Eighth Amendment is there for a reason, and it means it has to be applied to everyone, and we can't presume guilt no matter how much we like or dislike the individual defendant.
Yep.
The same is true in this context. But what happened was there was this liberal wave, professional class, managerial class wave of left sort of anti their parents. Frankly, it was like a parental rebellion a lot in the late 1960s of upper middle class professionals, but their kids in grad schools and colleges. I mean, just look at who was in the Weather Underground. It's not your poor working class revolutionary. It's upper middle class kid mad at mommy and daddy,
Yeah.
overwhelmingly. And so you that's and that what did that birth? That birthed a political backlash. That birthed the age of Dirty Harry films. That birthed the age of Death Wish films. That birthed the age of Bernie Getz getting acquitted in New York by the mid 80s, late 80s, because we, unleashed this sort of escape from New York political environment, crime environment that did not work out well. And what people forget is that it's kind of politically convenient now within some parts of the left to be critical of the crime reforms that Clinton and Biden put in the 90s. But that was because that was coming from black communities. Older members of the black community wanted a harsh crackdown on crime because of the crack epidemic and the gang epidemic that took place between the mid 80s and early 90s. And in fact, that massive incarceration kind of worked. I mean, the crime rate dramatically declined, disproportionately impactful on young black American men. But the flip side to it did lead to a massive reduction in crime, between the first meaningful reduction in crime in quite some time. Because we went from early 1960s, mid 1960s, through to the early 90s of just steady increases in crime, with skyrocketing in the late 60s, early 70s, and only began to decline in the 90s. And so, but the political rebellion was strong to the left's insistence on a soft on crime approach of the late 60s, early 70s. That mostly faded by the 90s. That was no longer, and now it's back. It's back with a vengeance. Combination of critical race theory and other theories that have taken over aspects of the legal academy and de-incarceration, though there's been a lot of hypocrisy from the left on de-incarceration. I don't see them talking about de-incarceration for January 6th defendants,
Right.
but they do want for their politically favored group. I mean, you go back to, people forget the Crips. The Crips are actually named like Committee for Revolution or whatever, right? The Black Panthers, well detailed in James Ellroy's American Tabloid trilogy, particularly the latter ones, the latest one being Bloods Are Over, which was written loosely fiction, but in fact factual, between 1963 and 1973 American political history. Part of it is he details how the Black Panthers are really just a front for extortionists and criminals and gangs and drug runners. And indeed, frankly, the Black Panthers started out that way, to purportedly to defend against illicit raids
Mm.
within the urban Black communities in Oakland. And there was a little bit of truth to that. But who was the primary beneficiary of that? Actual drug dealers were the primary beneficiary of that. Actual gangs were actually the primary beneficiary. That's why the Black Panthers easily devolved into being just a bunch of drug runners. Huey P. Newton, named after the great populist Huey P. Long by his mother, by the way, from Louisiana, devolved into, basically a rapist and a drug dealer. Why? Because that's who they were initially protecting and defending. And groups like the Crips came on board and they're like, look at this. The Black Panthers get to run a great extortion ring and get to protect their drug trade by pretending to be a political activist organization. This is a great gig. We'll just rename ourselves from whatever gang name we had before to the Committee for Revolution of da 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 da, and boom. And that's why, like, as soon as Black Lives Matter came on this screen, it was two things. One, they were clearly going to be a race grifting organization, for which has been popular on both the left and the right. Nick Fuentes is just a race grifter, wannabe pretend David Duke guy. I mean, he's in trouble because he likes to chase around boys in cat outfits and that kind of thing, but in his current political scandal issues. But the BLM is just the left version of that. I mean, the race grift is an old game that's been going on a century plus. I mean, W.B. Du Bois talks about it in the book, The Philadelphia Negro. That's the title of the book, by the way, for everybody out there. Of 1893, he wrote for the University of Pennsylvania, heavily Quaker-influenced institution at the time and still to this day, but really, especially then. And he writes about this element within the Philadelphia community, this permanent criminal class element. Now, arguably, we helped create that permanent criminal class element by mass incarceration and whatnot. But either way, BLM was always going to be part grifter and part cover for gangs, because who's going to be the number one beneficiary of the police being scared to have aggressive police tactics in big cities? It's going to be gangs, drug dealers. That's who.
True. Mm-hmm.
And they were going to run it for their benefit. That's why you had BLM marches in Minneapolis where you had groups that were part of the march who had actually used it as a cover to engage in bank robberies.
Wow,
Vice
really?
actually captured this live. Vice actually captured this group of people that were in the middle of this BLM protest group. They branch off to the bank and start breaking into the ATM machines right up there.
Wow.
And they know police are going to be nowhere near the scene because they don't want to get into confrontation with BLM, especially post-Chauvin in Minneapolis. This was immediately in the aftermath of that, George Floyd.
Right.
And so it was a great cover for old-fashioned heist. I mean, the people like Thomas Wolfe, brilliantly made fun of it in books like I always do a shortened version of the book. It's the Electric Kool-Aid Test, but the actual name of the book is longer than that, or title of it. But he talks about it. The Black Panthers doing fundraising parties in the Hamptons or the west side of LA, west side of Manhattan, Upper West Side. Same dynamic. That's what BLM was. Not a surprise they were grifting for mansions. They were founded by leftist folks who wanted to build up a Twitter presence to just cash in. They were not rooted in the Black community, not rooted in the civil rights community, not rooted in the Black business community. They were rooted in the old school sort of Marxist Popular Front type organization with a little grifter component, with a gang component underneath it. And so it's not a surprise that these leftist prosecutors that have been elected, especially in California, with the aid primarily of George Soros's cash, are not going to meaningfully criminally prosecute even people who attack Dave Chappelle, because Dave Chappelle is not part of the protected class right now. His attacker is more protected than he is in places like LA. And I think it's going to unleash crime, and we're seeing it. When you decriminalize theft under $1,000, you just encourage, going in and basically doing a bash and grab.
Yep.
And you're seeing that throughout on drugstores and shopping places. It's an involuntary shopping season in certain places. Look what happened in New York City. In New York City, during a lot of the BLM riots, when the police withdrew, there were professional thief operations going in and hitting jewelry stores and high-end clothing stores. Right? And they were just using the riots as the guise for it. This happened in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina. There are people going in and doing professional grabs. They did it during the Iraq War. There was a professional heist organization that, under the guise of as soon as the Iraqi war started and they seized Baghdad, so went into the Iraqi National Museum of Antiquities, clearly had a shopping list because of what they took. They didn't take everything. They only took like a select group things. And then it wasn't even like the highest value items. It was somebody gave them a shopping list. I want these 15 antiquities, and took the 15 antiquities, entered pretending to be Iraqi guard, exiting pretending to be U.S. troops, disappeared, never to be discovered or uncovered again.
Wow.
So, heist under the guise of these kind of events is not that big of a surprise, but we're going to have a lot more of it when it's basically welcome, invited, and not prosecuted by lefty DAs. And that just invites a criminal culture to explode. And I think it's what the system really wants down to.
I mean, what is the end game, you think? Do they want to just bring down America? Is that the goal?
I think it varies. I think for some of them, they are sincerely convinced themselves, at least, that this is a better way to fight crime, that this otherwise is sort of racial patriarchy and systematic institutionalized oppression that they're trying to reverse by not punishing these crimes that don't lead to the death of a protected class individual. I think that's part of it. Another part of it is the street theater of the 1930s. The fascists and the communists both used each other to engage in street violence, often against one another, for the purposes of gaining political leverage in the court of public opinion, as they saw it. If you won the street, you won the battle in their mindset. And that's what Antifa is doing. That's like, for example, Obama really thought, this is where Bannon's documentary on Occupy was at least partially right, which is that the left saw the Tea Party as the rise of the Nazi fascist and black shirts and brown shirts Italy and Germany in the 1920s and early 1930s. And so they wanted to counter that with Occupy. And they helped infiltrate the Occupy movement from a very early stage, co-opted that movement. Now, what happened in the Occupy movement? What broke it apart? Well, the problem is these are mostly political permission slips to sociopaths. It's what the Klan is. It's what the neo-Nazis in Ukraine are. It's what a lot of so-called Islamic fundamentalists are. They're not really motivated by the supposed ideology that warrants their actions. They're sociopaths who just want a political permission slip to go act out on their pathology. That's why they're so often personal criminals, right? Like they don't just commit politicized motivated violence. They commit domestic assault. They commit rape. They commit robbery. They commit other antisocial criminality behavior. That's often counterproductive for their purported political cause. The same is true here, and so the reaction was to unleash Occupy as a counter in their minds to the Tea Party. Fell apart, of course, because of all the rapes that were happening at Occupy rallies and things like that. You know, one of the stories they kind of suppressed on the backside, the left, and celebrating and the Occupy movement. And Antifa is just an extension of that. I mean, Antifa formulated as a disguised name of a communist organization in East Berlin in the 1920s, recreated in the 1970s in East Germany and West Germany. And then it spread to the United States, originally as the Black Bloc anarchist against the World Trade Organization, with destabilization of those protests in 1990s in Seattle, where you had a lot of legitimate protests that got completely derailed by the presence of Black Bloc anarchistic violence, which basically helped discredit. I mean, think about the word anarchy, right? The word anarchy is still associated in the Western mind with violence. That's not the history of anarchism as an ideology. You know, if you go back to Lysander Spooner and others, but it is in America. Why? Because of the way it was tarnished with the Haymarket riots, with other criminal prosecutions that took place after that, with J. Edgar Hoover's rise to power, blaming anarchists for things they probably didn't do in late 19 in response to the Palmer raids of the 1918. So you have, I think, what you see is wanting to have a street, in their minds, a street thug aspect to enforce leftist indoctrination and ideas. That's why, you know, today Joe Biden is, you know, the White House is like, go ahead, keep stalking and harassing federal United States Supreme Court justices, even though that is both a federal crime and a state crime.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you about that. But before we do, I would like you to define anarchy then, you know, because it seems like everyone, like you said, you hear the word anarchy and you think violence, you think buildings burning, and I'm just kind of, I've come to know anarchy a little bit differently with some of the people. I have Ace Archist coming on my show. Liza Blue claims to be an anarchist, anarcho-capitalist. And who else am I thinking of? Eric July. You know, I've heard some views from them, and I would like to hear your definition.
You know, I think the popularity of anarchy in certain social media circles is thanks to that little Ruski Michael Malice,
Yeah, definitely.
a genius marketer, funny guy, great comedian, and probably the best political advocate for anarchy in the United States, or anarchism as an ideology in the United States, maybe since Lysander Spooner. But my view of anarchy was sort of shaped, and anarchism was shaped by an experiment that I was part of at Governor's School for International Studies in high school, summer of a high school year in Tennessee. And they were teaching us about the power of currency, and they were using this project to do it. But in the process of it, what it revealed to me was that basically we have 100 people in this room, and we're going to pick 4 of us to govern the rest of us. And not only that, we're going to give them the exclusive right of violence against the rest of us in many contexts, and the exclusive means of certain violence against the rest of us. And to me, anarchism just is anti-statism. Anarchism is, we're not going to give 4 people the exclusive right or exclusive tools of violence against the rest of us. That's all I think it is philosophically. And that everything should be contractually agreed to and consented to is the predicate of, it's the difference between society and the state. You can have society without having a state. The sort of anti-anarchism mythology is that you can't have society without a state. That's really not true. Because to me, the definition of a state is just that: exclusive means of violence against the rest of us, exclusive a right of violence in certain contexts against the rest of us. Now, in the modern world, you could add exclusive control of financial system. But the bottom line is that exclusive control of the financial system probably doesn't matter if you don't have the exclusive means and exclusive right of violence to back it up.
Yeah.
So in the end, that's all anarchism is. Anarchism doesn't have to be violent at all. And an argument is that the anarchistic movement was infiltrated by people that were actually opposed to anarchy, who interjected violence as a means of revolution to actually discredit the appeal of anarchism, is particularly in the era of the Industrial Revolution, and that was expounded and expanded upon by people like Hoover, who blamed anarchists for things that probably anarchists didn't do, whether it was the bombing on Wall Street, whether it was the bombing of Attorney General Palmer that led to the Palmer raids, that empowered a young J. Edgar Hoover, that helped create a Federal Bureau of Investigation with its separate independent power within the Justice Department, but no longer under its real rubric and control, and that unleashed a deep state apparatus. And the best argument for anarchism, in my view, is that core argument, which is what happens when there's only four of us that are going to, well, I call it the problem of the concentration of power, which is not solved by monarchism, which some anarchists like Curtis Yarvin, Mencius Moldbug have adhered to. I'm a strong opponent to that, because monarchism is just dictatorship by another name with a fancy
Hmm.
title. It still has the problem is concentration of power in a small number of hands. What's the likelihood that the people who seek that power, and in particular are successful in seeking that power, are going to be the best amongst us versus the worst amongst us?
Right.
Chances are it's the sociopaths and psychopaths who are going to want it, and are in particular are going to be successful at getting it. This is the fundamental premise of Alex Jones. Alex Jones' whole interpretation of the world and why he's skeptical of people in positions of power is he believes that people that successfully seek power are the worst human beings amongst us. And you have to assume that they have the worst possible intentions, and you will be better prepared than if you assume they have the best possible intentions. And
Got that
so
right.
I think the best argument for anarchism. I'm still skeptical in terms of its practicality and desirability in the public world, but I often say I'm a constitutional populist with anarchistic tendencies, because I distrust the state and I distrust concentration of power in a few hands.
Do you think
Uh,
it's
per-
possible to have a society that isn't tied to the state? Like, is it because humans are inherently evil? I mean, there will always, well, rather, there's always going to be evil human beings. Those people with sociopathic um, you know, uh, you know, whatever, that's their mind state. That's what they want. They want the power. They want to be able to control other people. They're always going to seek that out. I see this world, an anarchist society, and I think that those people that want that power are still going to try to seek it out and force it upon others if there isn't like a legal measure for them to do so, which is working for the state.
right, and that's where my view is: you're always going to have that problem of bad people wanting to do bad things to other people.
Right.
The question is, do you give them the exclusive right and exclusive means of weapons? Do you give them armies and nuclear weapons? If
Right.
you give them armies and nuclear weapons, what's the likelihood? I always tell people that if put me in an anarchistic society versus the governments that have run the world over the last century, which one would I be safer in?
True.
It's tough for a private gang to form a huge army. It's tough for a private gang to get access and create nuclear weapons. So it's the scale of violence and the legal right and entitlement to violence by the collectivization of individuals for that purpose of violence, such as armies, is what makes the state a more dangerous tool for the sociopath than no state, at
True.
least in theory. Now, I agree, as a practical matter, it's not something that I see realistically being implemented. I see the state as a necessary evil in that sense. And the key is keeping as much popular limitation and control, public limitation and control on these people as possible. It's one of the reasons why I love the Second Amendment. I believe the Second Amendment was meant to democratize the legal right of violence, to give it to each individual for their own defense, the defense of themselves and others and their loved ones. And I believe it should extend to property. And so that removes it from being a state monopoly. That I think that the Second Amendment is at the cutting edge of freedom and liberty in the country, because if you don't have democratization of the right and means of violence against others, and you give it instead and let the state monopolize it, it's almost a guarantee that will go badly.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. So let's talk about what's going on. I mean, I'm seeing um, rallies, chanting outside of the Supreme Justice's houses, and you mentioned it is illegal to do so. Why? I guess my first question is, why the hell are they not doing anything about it if it is illegal? It's
It's
crazy to see.
I mean, I can't believe that they forgot this. I mean, you generally have a First Amendment right of protest, even at
Sure.
people's homes. There, but with an exception. The exception has always been judges and justices. So there's a separate federal law that says you, and the reason is it's considered a form of obstruction of justice.
Ah,
Because if you try to reach a judge outside of the court, there's a proceeding by which for a judge to make a determination. It's based
mhm,
on legal documents and evidence admitted and introduced and argued inside the four corners of a courtroom.
okay.
They should not be influenced at all by anything that happens outside of the four corners of that
It's
courtroom.
intimidation.
Absolutely. Anything else is a perversion of justice. Anything else is an obstruction of justice. Anything else is a form of intimidation or harassment or simply influence. Like, let's say you
Yep.
weren't even trying to intimidate them. You're trying to influence them outside the four corners of that courtroom, and that's an obstruction and perversion of justice. Not supposed to happen. And so that's why there's specific federal laws that says you cannot try to influence a federal judge about a pending case outside of the four corners of that courtroom, period. Especially efforts to intimidate them, especially efforts to go to their private residence. And then you have state laws, Virginia laws and other states that also make it a crime to try to intimidate judges or try to even protest their homes. Doesn't even matter if your goal is intimidation or not. It is a crime in the state of Virginia to protest or petition a judge's home about a pending case. Because again, that's just not within first, because that's a perversion of their function within the government.
Right.
You can, everyone else you have First Amendment rights to, but not this one, and that's because the courts consider that to be a reasonable limitation on First Amendment freedoms. And so, because of the perversion of justice and intimidating effect it can have, but what it shows is that when the politics are on the left, DC won't do anything. Nobody in
Right.
DC will do anything. FBI, Justice Department, they won't do anything. They wouldn't do anything when they were rioting right outside the White House. And now if your grandma and you pass the wrong barrier on January 6th at the Capitol, then they'll throw you in the hoosegow. But
Right.
if you're throwing fire bombs at one of the famous churches across from the White House, they'll be like, that's it. They'll sue you for civil rights violations. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the insanity of it. Again, they just think they're legally entitled to use their street thugs for their will. The ends justify the means for the new left. They don't believe in any purity of any means. They don't believe in the integrity of any means. Judges are there to get the right outcome. They don't care whether the law. They could care less about the rule of law.
Yep.
It's about their rule. That's what it means.
That's
And
true.
it's the same here. And they love the street theater and street violence. What is sad is that local people in Virginia are not doing anything about it. That state, the governor has said some things, but that should be a sheriff's office operation. But the problem is, the other thing is, where do these justices choose to live? They chose to live within close proximity of DC or in DC itself. The problem is that those suburbs of Maryland, those suburbs of Virginia are overwhelmingly left Democratic controlled areas. So the
Yep.
local sheriff, the local police force, the local system, along with the federal system, wants the left to engage in this violence, which the president of the United States is basically winking at through his press secretary, as he said again today in their speech. I think they were purportedly trying to say we encourage the peacefulness, but what it came across as, we encourage you to keep doing what you're doing. It's a
Yep.
crime. It's an actual crime. I believe what Biden has done in this capacity is an impeachable offense. It's the
Wow.
misuse and abuse of presidential power to intimidate a Supreme Court into not following their lawful constitutional obligations in violation of both federal and state criminal law. And hopefully, when the Republicans take back the House, it is part of the articles of impeachment against him. The Senate will never convict,
Of course
but
not.
it's worthwhile to document this activity should not be happening.
Well, I mean, the left does whatever they want. They don't care. It feels like I was talking about this yesterday. We're at this point where people are waking up and recognizing how corrupt the left is, how many places that they've infected with their ideology. And look at Texas had a crazy sweep of Republicans taking over just school boards. So at a base level and the local level in Texas, there's been this huge shift towards people getting involved in their local politics, which is the key. Getting into the local level and taking that over is absolutely a must. And I feel like we're kind of seeing it. And it's because, that they're kind of outing themselves by going so hard because they're grasping that power. The internet, the censorship, the stuff that, people are sharing the actual truth. They're like, hey, this is all wrong. Look at this. They're watching you guys, Viva Barnes. A lot of people tell me they watch you guys and get the real truth of what's going on. And Nick Rekieta is also doing that kind of stuff. I mean, so many people are being red pilled from so many different things, like the "Don't Say Gay" bill. It's like most people are like, oh yeah, I don't want anyone indoctrinating my kids, gay or not. And by the way, it doesn't say anything about being gay. And then I'm like, these parents are like, all right, I'm going to be involved now because clearly they want to indoctrinate our kids. And it's we're seeing it almost run rampant. Like they don't even care anymore. They're not even trying to hide it anymore because they have to. This is the last chance, because if they don't maintain that power over everyone, they're going to lose it. And I feel I'm being optimistic, obviously, but I feel like Americans are waking up to the hypocrisy and the control psychopaths that are in power. And
I
I believe it.
Yeah, I think it's a puritanical, totalitarian, authoritarian mindset where
Yep.
the ends justify the means. The analogy I've given to people is study the mindset of both the fascist and communist in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. That there you'll understand the mindset. The ends justify the means. They don't care about the inherent integrity of any of these institutions. They're not conservative in the sense of wanting to conserve anything.
Right.
They're more like French revolutionaries in their mindset. They don't mind what they torch in the process. They often don't understand the collateral consequences of their course of conduct because that's who and what they are. And they're totalitarian, so they will want to control everything. The Nazis wanted to control the German version of the Boy Scouts. The communists were the same, and the Soviets were the same. They can and like, for example, one of the great first mistakes these people made, it's sort of managerial class dominance, was, it's one thing to infiltrate human resource departments and then, popular front strategies that the communists used in the 1920s and 30s. Fascists used to some degree as well in Italy, Spain, and Germany at different times between the 1920s and 1940s. This idea that you have to have total control. You've got to control the church. You've got to control the schools. You've got to control the media. You've got to control the universities. But you've also got to control the human resource departments that determine in hiring and firing. You've also got to control advertising and marketing departments. You've also got to determine the filmmaking and book producing industries. But like, one of their mistakes was when they tried to take over the gaming community. Like, it was like those are nerds to leave alone.
Yeah.
These are some autists playing their games at home, having fun. My son's ideal world is going to be a Ready Player One world where he gets to dominate because of his game dominance, right? These
Yeah.
are people to leave alone. They were almost all apolitical, didn't care, overwhelmingly young, but they couldn't. They wanted to take it over, and they did it through journalistic corruption in the gaming community, exposed by various scandals of reporters sleeping with certain so-called game creators and then promoting them for either politicized or personal corruption purposes at the expense of the audience, saying this is actually not good games. And that led to Gamergate, and that led to the political red pilling of an entire generation. All of a sudden, you've got the Sargon of Akkad. All of a sudden, even Mike Cernovich got more politically active from where he had been, and Gamergate was the sort of the door to him getting politically engaged when a lot of Gen Xers were opting out of politics, saying politics is a waste of time. It was a
Yeah.
sucker's game. It's Tweedledum and Tweedledummer were your two options politically. It educated this entire new constituency that came to political life. Well, they instead of backing off, they did the same thing in the science fiction culture, leading to the Vox Days of the world having political platforms, et cetera, and rebellion against it. But they can't help themselves. And what people didn't realize is since 2014, they weren't just doing this on your Facebook page. There wasn't just an explosion in the New York Times on terminology we hadn't seen before. Basically, someone who liked Barack Obama in 2012 would be seen as a right-wing counter-reactionary or counter-revolutionary today. The who was an Obama supporter in 2012, because that's how fast and rapid this woke left took over popular culture. But just like trying to take over games was a major mistake, trying to take over comics was a major mistake. Going after popular brands like Marvel, like Star Wars, like Star Trek was a major mistake. It
Oh, yeah.
creates the nerdotics and the critical drinkers of the world and the platform for them and the doomcocks of the world.
Hmm.
But trying to take over little kids' public schoolrooms for their agenda was another major mistake. And the
Agreed.
only way they were getting away with it is parents didn't fully know the scale of it.
Enter
I mean,
2020.
exactly. All of a sudden, people are like, hold on a second. My 7-year-old is being taught that maybe they're a girl when they're born a boy, or
Yeah.
that they're, or vice versa, that they're being taught about, basically, it's like, Mr. Garrison from South Park was showing up with Mr. Head and the Slave to talk to the kids. And they're like, hold on a
Right.
second. That should be a South Park skit. That shouldn't
Right.
be my actual 8-year-old, learning about this. Oh, mommy likes mommy. And I mean, this goes all the way back to My Two Mommies and trying to infiltrate children's book literature with a lot of these ideologies and
Yep.
things that were insane just a while ago. Ironic to some degree. The religious conservative community, my religious conservative friends, said from day one, they said, where's the line? If the line isn't gay marriage, where's the line? Okay, if gay marriage is fine, well, you're telling me that line's not going to keep moving and moving and moving until there's no moral principle at all.
Right.
And they turned out to be right, because first it was gay marriage, then now you have to bake my cake for me. No, now men are women and women are men. And now it's you're bigoted if you question it. And now it's your 6-year-old needs to be taught this.
Yep.
And parents proud. I mean, doing experimentation on young children to change their body chemistry for life in a way that no science or medicine supports. This is
Correct.
insanity. And doing
Agreed.
so against parental knowledge and parental awareness. So what it did is all of a sudden you took a bunch of, the only people who believe in this are your post-college, Ivy League, elite liberal arts, Tufts, those kind of schools, Bard, etc. Not your college educated mom at home who might not like Donald Trump's persona, might have gone along with the Trump criticism and the criticism of populism and the demonization of it, up until it's her 7-year-old being told that she is really a he or he's really a she.
Hmm.
That was like, hold on a second. And now they're getting a popular revolution. A lot of times in the suburbs, Virginia, New Jersey, Democrats lost massive headway in the suburbs, in the upper middle class suburbs, even because your college educated state university works at as a mid-level white collar clerk, is not on board with having their 7-year-old taught sex education, is
Right.
not on board with their 7-year-old being taught their gender isn't their gender, is not on board with the attempts to force gender, this experimentation on children, because that's what it really is in it. And then when they doubled down with the vaccine, tried to force it through in DC with fraudulent medical statements, with doctors injecting kids without their parents knowing,
Crazy.
it just showed them, okay, they really believe what Joe Biden said, which is it's no longer your kid when they show up at the public school. And
Yep.
that has shocked a lot of people and a lot of parents, and we're seeing the rebellion that comes from that.
I can't believe that Biden actually said that. For those who don't know, Biden actually he was talking. What was he talking to? Like a teacher convention. I don't remember exactly what it was, but he was speaking to a bunch of teachers, and he basically said, they're our kids. They're your kids when they enter the classroom. It's like, no, you're a teacher. They are not your peers. They are not your friends. You're supposed to teach them the curriculum. They are not yours. They are the parents' kids. Period. Done. End of conversation. And that's, I mean, it's classic, Marxism. They're trying
Oh
to
yeah,
create the next wave of army for them to continue
it's
the battle.
I mean, the people who did it better were the fascists in Germany. The Nazis really, the communists did it decently with their little, summer camps and the rest, but the fascists had it at every single level. I mean, created their own version of the Boy Scouts, all the. So from the time you're 3 years old, you're owned by the state, and the state dictates your future and dictates your agenda and shapes your mindset. And
Yep.
this was just never popular. And that's why the political rebellion, especially in the United States, will continue to grow. And this is something the wokesters never understood. I mean, this is why, Netflix is getting sued in a class action because
Are
they've
they?
been lying to people about their subscriber growth, and they had to, because the reality is nobody wants woke crap on Netflix. Make
Right.
more shows like Ozarks, make more shows like Stranger Things, make fewer shows that show men pregnant.
Right.
This is common sense.
Right. And well, that's interesting too. I heard that Twitter actually was doing the same thing. They were misrepresenting their numbers, which wouldn't it inflate the price of the shares? Then I mean,
They
how
better
is
hope
that
that sale to Elon Musk goes through, because if not, they're going to face a massive class action from multiple angles. One
true?
of which, it will be mooted if the sale goes through. But if the sale doesn't go through, you're not only going to have lawsuits related to the failure to sell, but you're also going to have lawsuits due to the fact that they've been inflating their numbers for a while. I mean, Facebook faces one of the biggest class actions that could bankrupt them, because they lied in their advertising dollars. They said that if you were spending X amount of money, you were reaching a certain number of people within your target group, and they were
Yeah.
exaggerating by a ratio of anywhere from 3 to 10,
Wow.
which doesn't surprise me. My little sister had a barbecue place here in Las Vegas for a while, and the Facebook advertising never seemed to translate like it was supposed to. It said we were reaching X number of people, and yet that didn't show up or translate to sales, whereas like regular free publicity did. And
Right.
it's like, okay, why is there such a discrepancy and disparity? Well, now we know it's because Facebook was lying the whole time. Their entire monetization was based on fake numbers.
Wow. And they're currently in a lawsuit right now. Facebook is.
A massive class action on that exact issue.
Wow. So where can people find more about that? Is that something that you and Viva cover on your stuff?
Yeah. So we cover it whenever there are any updates about it on the Sunday show.
Cool.
And so people can see it there. Of course, Netflix faces a big class action that could be bankrupting because of the scale of their misrepresentations just in the
Wow.
last quarter. Twitter will face this if their sale to Elon Musk doesn't go through. It's, I think, part of the reason why it was a unanimous vote.
Yeah.
Musk and other information would have come out in the due diligence process, so might as well get ahead of this by just selling it and moving on.
Yeah. Who's
Because
the one who brings the lawsuit against them?
in the case of, if they don't sell to Elon Musk, people like Clay Travis and others have said they'll sue on the grounds that it was a breach of the fiduciary duty, the obligation of the members of the board.
Mhm.
If also they don't sell, it's anybody whose stock was lost value due to their misrepresentations at key junctures. So that would be the other factor, because if the Musk sale didn't go through, that stock would take a major hit,
Right.
particularly compared to the price point he was offering, but also to the price point it was at even beforehand. Estimation was 10 to 20% decline. And some of this information has started to leak out about what Twitter was up to, which would lead to other suits based on misrepresentation by the board and its CEOs and its corporate lawyer, who's getting paid 17 million.
It's
17
crazy.
million
A
as a
year.
lawyer?
That's
I
insane.
mean, totally insane. I mean, 17 million is nuts. So you're being bribed when you're getting paid 17 million. You're not
Yeah.
getting paid.
Yeah, you got that right. Now you've worked with some pretty big names over the past decade. I didn't even know that you were representing Alex Jones in his deposition that you mentioned earlier. And I wanted to ask about Kyle Rittenhouse, and you said something about a Kyle's law, something about helping, making sure that you know people who are in his situation don't have to face what he faced. And are you still representing him?
Not still representing him.
Okay.
May in the future, but not at this juncture. The idea of Kyle's law
Hmm.
was basically what came up with by Andrew Bronco, law of self defense. He's had this idea for a while, but it was a good title to put Kyle's law on it. Bronco's like surprisingly funny. You don't, when you first see him, you think New Jersey, older school lawyer from Boston, now lives in Colorado, has good kind of almost dry interpretation, basic, stick to the law interpretation when he does his self defense videos. But then you see him on on Ricada, and he's just like he's got one of the driest, sharpest wits on the planet. It's just
Nice.
like one thing after the next. Like Amber Heard, they just flashed to Amber Heard, and Bronco's like, yeah, first the Jews, second the Gypsies, third I mean, just because of how she looks like a Nazi. I mean, it's just boom, 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 boom.
Yeah.
And then he's got like eternal jokes about his ex. So it's just a lot of stuff like that. That's great. That's classic. But especially if he's been drinking a little late on a Ricada show, night show, especially
Ricada
when he's rolling.
Ricada show are something special, aren't they?
No doubt, no doubt. Nick's one of a kind.
Yeah, he
It's
is.
great to see his show explode. I mean, I remember when I first was introduced to it, I saw the preview, and I was like, man, it's a little bit different. The background and the
Just a little
hard
different.
rock music, and you see some of the live chat, and you're like, whoa, Fuda, what? I don't know about this. But I was like, okay, I'll appear, and then you figure out he's exceptionally sharp. I mean,
Really?
widely diverse information, knows about a broad range of topics legally and culturally and politically. I don't know how he gets
Mhm.
time for. He's got like 5 kids. I don't know how he
I know.
manages all and I think he like helps homeschool them too. So it's like,
Yep.
how he manages this, I don't know. But
Robot.
and real in-depth knowledge about the law. That's
True.
kind of deceptive because he's one of these self-deprecating personalities,
Mhm.
but much sharper on the law than you would anticipate. And as most of these
Sure.
TV lawyer types, I wouldn't ever hire for a case. Nick Ricade, I would hire for a case in a heartbeat. Very
Definitely.
sharp, very independent-minded. But the idea behind Kyle's law is we should. I'm opposed to all immunity for the government. Period. I don't.
Okay.
Immunity comes from the idea that the king could do no wrong because he was God's representative on earth. Back to the monarchist. My problem with monarchies. I agree with Thomas Paine about monarchy. But it's like that's nuts. We don't live in an age where we have a king that's been appointed by God. We don't pretend this nonsense anymore.
Right.
You could just look at a lot of the kings and figure out God didn't appoint those people. Just look at the Habsburgs. I mean, their jaws would go like this. Why? Because they were like their
Incest.
genetic tree didn't branch. That's
Mhm.
why. It was just cousin, uncle, niece, uncle, niece, uncle, niece. I mean, different. There were a lot of Uncle Joe Bidens in the Habsburg family,
Oh god.
and
Oh
it just
no.
went all the way down the tree. But so the idea. So I don't agree with sovereign immunity. Period. But I think, in particular, as to prosecutors who prosecute people based on self-defense, and the person is acquitted, the government should have to write the check for all the legal fees and cost that they cause that individual at a minimum, and that's what Kyle's law is predicated upon. It's don't bring this case. Now, I like also what Florida has. I think there should be a right to bring a preliminary case that if a judge isn't satisfied that there's really a reasonable chance that a reasonable jury could convict based on just a preliminary hearing, but a meaningful preliminary hearing, unlike the ones we have currently in the United States, where probable cause has been reduced to nothing effectively,
Yeah.
that you could get dismissal of the charges at that stage. But the idea that Brunca had for Kyle's law, I think, makes eminent sense. Naming it after Kyle makes particular sense, which is that, look at if Kyle did not have as many people come to his public defense as did, including me and others, he would not have been able to raise the funds for a meaningful legal defense.
True.
And I volunteered all of my time, but you can't ask lawyers all the time to just donate time, or they're going to go broke and bust themselves.
Yeah.
So normally a guy like Kyle would have been just run over. Public defenders, God bless them, don't usually have the skill set needed to defend someone in a case as high profile as that one.
True.
And he was only able to do so because he was able to mount a defense. But if the government knows they have to write a check at the end of the case if they lose, they're
Yeah.
going to be a lot more careful about which cases they pursue.
Oh
In a
yeah.
case like Kyle, they never would have pursued in the first place because down deep, they knew they didn't have a case. They were
Yep.
just hoping they could bluff their way through it.
Yeah, and they really needed it for the narrative too. If they were able to win that case, we would still hear about it. It would still be something that just like the insurrection of January 6th, it would be just another one on the things to remind their base to continue being angry. Like, remember this. Remember we got that white supremacist. They all, and now he's suing all those people. Do you know much about that whole thing?
He hasn't sued them yet. He's looking at that as an option or opportunity. There's been a range of news reports that have claimed he sued him that are not accurate news reports.
What about the
So,
Whoopi Goldberg thing? Didn't she try to get a case dismissed?
he didn't sue her. That
Oh, it
was
wasn't him.
Yeah, well, what happened is there's a news source that was inaccurate
Ah,
that
of course.
it was exactly. And there's been a bunch of those. So there's been a bunch of stories of claiming that he sued different people, that those people lost their motions to dismiss. No such suits have been filed to date that I'm aware of.
Interesting. I'm
The
sure you would
it,
be though if it did happen.
Yeah, if he did. I mean, the hard part is this for someone in Kyle's position. Once you've been criminally prosecuted, it's almost impossible to win a defamation suit, because it's considered a probable cause establishment. Now he was not a public figure, so that but once you've been indicted, any post-indictment story, you're considered a public figure usually. Not always, but usually. So I think it's very hard to win a defamation case. This is why Kyle's law needs to be there. It's
Right.
very hard to win such a case if in fact you are innocent because you've just been prosecuted. I mean, there's fair reporting privilege, which says you can report on anything that's been alleged in court. And so that's probably necessary to protect a robust free press, but that gives prosecutors immense power to permanently smear someone in ways that is irremediable. They can't remedy after the fact. And there'll
Yeah.
be a percentage of people that always will believe he's a racist. There'll be a
True.
percentage of people that will always believe he deliberately killed those people. Totally false, utterly false. Just like they think he carried a gun across state lines, a blatant lie that
Yeah.
they just continue to repeat until I mean, almost all the Young Turks peoples repeated this.
Oh,
Everybody
the
that's even
Young
connected to
Turks.
them, so it's been one embarrassment after the next. But the Kyle case was very educational for people about the legal system,
True.
very educational for people about self-defense rights, but also very educational about too much power being in the hands of the prosecutors and the press, especially in criminal cases that you can't get any remedy for, even when you get fully acquitted, as Kyle did.
It's interesting. I look back at the past 2 years, and as crazy as these past 2 years have been, it really does feel like all it's doing, it's like a big silver lining. It's showing everybody, all different facets. We got the parents, with protecting their children. We have the medical freedom people that are like, I don't want to be pushed into anything. The election stuff, the Rittenhouse case, people who believe that you should be able to defend yourself, especially when it's very clearly self-defense, when they were actually going after him. And it was proven in court. I don't feel like I needed to even see anything because, I did see it all as it happened. All the videos, how everyone was filming everything. Everyone does film everything. And that's the beauty of it. Like, we're seeing everything for ourselves, that we could look at the news and go, wow, look how much bullshit that is. That's not even close to what we're seeing. So the past 2 years have just been one massive red pill for a lot of people. And I do feel like there's starting to do you think do you feel like there's a shift that's coming back a little bit?
Well, I think there was always going to be one,
Yeah.
because what I told people at the very beginning of this, these are not popular concepts. This will be revealed in box office numbers for some of the TV shows and
Oh,
streaming
yeah.
services and films, and books. This will be revealed in what happens in elections over time. This will be revealed in what happens in public opinion over time. Because we've seen this before. This is the late 1960s redo in a more precarious manner, arguably. And what was the response? It was Dirty Harry. It was Death Wish. It was Ronald Wilson Reagan. That was the response. I mean, it was a quarter century of conservative political dominance at a national level. I mean, Jimmy Carter was frankly a conservative, definitely by today's terms. Now,
True.
not a conservative Republican, but conservative nevertheless. I mean, he was a conservative evangelical Southern Baptist, and whatnot. Now, he tried to bridge the gap between his base and the young professional class McGovern base, and that's what killed him ultimately. As he made too many betrayals of his base in exchange for that new rising Democratic San Francisco style base. But there just isn't a majority for that. Well, woke ideas are just never popular. And the one difference has been the ability to live in a bubble is much stronger now than it was then.
True.
Now you can just listen to your own publications, talk to your own people. Social media and big tech algorithms reinforce liberal woke biases,
Oh,
and you
yeah.
can pretend. Now, it's still hard to ignore box office numbers. It's still hard to ignore subscriber numbers. It's still hard to ignore election turnout numbers,
Yep.
but they will ignore it as long as they can until they're completely wiped out.
No, they're
And they'll
hiding the
use
like
any
button.
yeah, exactly. I mean, just one thing after the next,
Mhm.
allowing disabling of comments by the White House channel.
Yep.
These kind of tactics, you can only go so far, but they're very much like the Pravda types and the fascists, in that they're so totalitarian. They only listen to themselves. I mean, there were Germans who really believed they were right about to win the war, all the way up till Berlin actually completely fell. I
Wow.
mean, we're about to win the war. I mean, there were Egyptians who thought they were winning the 6-Day War because the Egyptian media, we took out some more Israeli planes, we got them on the run, and then all of a sudden they see the Egyptian army coming back all beat up. They're like, hold on a second. So this, I mean, we're seeing it right now in Ukraine. It's like the Monty Python skit with the soldier who's lost both arms and lost both legs, and he's like,
Yeah.
come on back. That was just a nick. We're seeing that there. And sooner or later, it blows up because you can only sustain and maintain that degree of self-deception for so long
True.
until it collapses. And we're seeing its collapse in the economic rejection of the woke cultural agenda. We're seeing it collapse in the rejection at a local political level. Ultimately, it will be a national political level, both the midterms and the presidential election upcoming. And we're seeing it in a range of other places and spaces that will continue unabated. They wouldn't have to engage in algorithmic manipulation in big tech if it wasn't the case that the unpopular programs that are woke are unpopular, and the popular programs they're suppressing are the unwoke or anti-woke programs that they have to try to repress because they're natively more popular with the audience. So sooner
Yeah.
or later, they can't sustain and maintain this wokester ideology because it's just not popular. And as more people wake up to its recognition and its reality, all you're going to see is more rebellion and reaction against it.
Yep, and it's coming right now. I've actually heard you speak about Ukraine multiple times, and I am curious. Before we get into super chats, I wanted to hear your opinion on what is like the reality of Ukraine. What? Because I've learned, I've kind of kept an eye on it. I've tried to do some research. I found out there's actually two immense oil reserves there, and a lot of natural gas off the coast of the southern coast, obviously. And it was discovered, but they don't have the infrastructure to build gas to sell it essentially. And of course, now we have all these senators with children that are on the gas boards, and it's like, I don't trust it at all. And then, of course, now, the whole war started. What is your take on the war in Ukraine?
So Ukraine is sort of a bifurcated deep state project. So at one level, it's a globalist project. George Soros has been obsessed with it now, probably his number one project above anything else.
I didn't even
Has been
know
this.
that. Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, it goes all the way back. I mean, George Soros was massively investing in Ukraine, even when it was part of the Soviet Union in the early '90s, late '80s.
Oh, wow.
Developed NGOs that he placed there. Really, it was kind of his dream project. Because for his globalist vision and the globalist vision that's shared with people like Klaus Schwab and the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds and the Bill Gateses of the world and all of them. And the fundamental premise was they needed to provoke Russia to invade Ukraine at some point, and had been trying to get that reaction for 15 years, ever since they realized Putin was a populist nationalist who was not on board with either wokesterism or globalism.
Right.
Once that became clear, and that Russia would no longer be the happy colony it had been when we were ravaging and raping it for about a decade after 1990. I mean, we had almost destroyed Russia by 1999, 2000. And instead of doing that, Putin wanted to rebuild it. Putin's fundamental premise was a 1997 graduate thesis he wrote when he was between jobs in the University of St. Petersburg, where he argued that Russia could rebuild itself because real power was not the globalist financial power at the top, controlling the banking system and the financial system and the lending system, but rather was real power of what people always had to have: food, fuel, particularly up next, military power, nuclear weapons for self-protection, self-preservation.
Yeah.
And this was a grand test of that. And the globalists needed to keep poking the Russian bear, using Ukraine to do so, keep poking it, hoping it would invade. That would be their justification for waging economic war on Russia, with the belief that that would crush Russia. They would go back in to recolonize Russia, divvy it up, remove Putin, get back to where it was in the 90s, and it would be an example to the world. We, the globalists, control the financial purse strings. That means we govern the world, regardless of military power, regardless of food, regardless of fuel, regardless of natural resources, regardless of And if Putin couldn't resist, you can't resist. If you're in India or Brazil or Mexico or Indonesia, wherever you may be, you can't resist. So primarily, this Ukraine war is a proxy war between Russia and the globalists, between nationalism and globalism, between the idea that resource-driven power matters more and hard military power matters more than soft financial, diplomatic, and political power and
Wow.
cultural power does. The second level was an old deep state agenda going back to the end of World War II, which was after World War II, we went into bed with a lot of Nazis throughout Europe because we were looking for who has built-in infrastructure of intelligence networks, supply networks, sabotage networks, smuggling networks that's deeply anti-communist. Well, the Nazis, that's who. So that's why we helped a whole bunch of them escape. We wanted their information for torture, for human experimentation, for rocket building, for biological weapon development, for nuclear missiles, everything. There was a lot of engineering and scientific skill that we wanted, and that's Operation Paperclip, and that only covers a part of the people we brought over. Klaus Barbie was helping to develop what became the Colombian drug trade, was originally the Bolivian drug trade, which you can read about or listen to Michael Levine on the Eric Hunley Unstructured podcast about, the greatest DEA agent in history who left because he discovered the scale to which the deep state was involved in drug running. And who is it? All goes back to Nazis and Klaus Barbie, of course. So we bet in Ukraine itself is all it means is borderlands. It's all the country means. It had no national identity as the borderlands until the early 1900s. Before then, it was basically divvied up between Western Ukraine, which would usually been part of the Polish-Lithuanian Empire. Before that, they considered themselves what was called Ruthenians, the first Ukrainian nationalist organization in the United States, even in the early 1900s, called themselves the Ruthenian National Organization. This is because they tie themselves to the Kievan Rus, who also Russia ties themselves to. The Rus were actually Swedish and Nordic, came down, but they organized the Eastern Slavs together such that they took on the name of the Rus, hence the Russians. But a variation of it was the Ruthenians. When the Kievan Rus collapsed, what became Russia moved to the north, and what became Ruthenia was just southwest of Kiev. And they tied their history to that. And this was the heart of Ukrainian nationalism. But they were mostly part of the Polish-Lithuanian Empire or Poland through most of their history. Then you had central and southern Ukraine, which was heavily dominated by one of my favorite all-time groups, the Cossacks. The Cossacks wrote that great letter. There's a big painting and story about it, about the letter they wrote to the Sultan, which they just insult him and all these they insult them in like a Ricada chat kind of way. It's like every crude and crass little image is fantastic. So the Cossacks dominated that part, and they're a very independent group. And so they're at different parts of different places. Then you have sort of the hard eastern part of Ukraine, which was historically part of Russia, going back to the 1700s. And over time, the Russian Empire would take over more and more of Ukraine, but never far west Ukraine. Far west Ukraine would ultimately be split up between the Austro-Hungarian and Polish empires and Polish governments. And Ukrainian nationalism would emerge in that region. And it would emerge as a fascistic ideology. They borrowed heavily from Mussolini in Italy. And that's why they easily made bed with the Nazis when the Nazis rise to power. They briefly had power in the between 1917 and 1921 before it went because the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapses. But ultimately, the Poles come in and take over. Stepan Bandera, who's now got statues to him all the way across Ukraine, has museums dedicated to him all across Ukraine. He's in prison in the 1920s for assassinating a Polish leader. He ultimately aligns himself with the Nazis because for multiple reasons. But honestly, it's because their fascistic ideology easily blended with it. They engaged in mass murder against the Poles and the Jews when they obtain power when the Germans come in. But the Nazis, of course, have no interest in elevating Slavs over time. They're very anti-Slavic in their prejudices, and they repress the Ukrainian nationalists and reduce their role in power. Bandera ultimately is released. He's given kind of power by the Nazis, and ultimately partially released. He's put in prison for a while, then released for a while, and ultimately ends up in Germany after the war. The CIA goes in and builds a connection with Bandera's groups in far western Ukraine. We help promote this sort of myth of Ukrainian nationalism in the sense that there was no nationwide unity for Ukrainian identity. Cossacks had one idea, Russians had another idea. Central and eastern Ukraine and northern Ukraine was heavily village-based. So it's like this great, if you read some of the old letters, you read these Bolshevik letters complaining about how originally the peasants were with him and now the peasants are against him. And he explains, it's amazing that they had to have this explained to them, but the peasants explain, the first time you Bolsheviks came to us, you said, get your gun and take back your land from the landlord. Now you're coming to us and saying, give you our gun and give you our land. Yeah, we're not for the latter. So no, thank you. The very locally based, and this even has Cossack ties in large parts of central and eastern Ukraine. Of course, in the 1930s, when the Soviets have control of central and eastern Ukraine, is when the Soviet famine happens. It's not a Ukrainian-specific famine, contrary to the mythology that we would actually help develop in the 1980s at Harvard. as an anti-communist project. The Soviet famine may have been targeted at kulaks and Cossacks, which were disproportionately present in eastern Ukraine, but they were also present in Kazakhstan and the Caucasus throughout. And the famine was just across the board. It was not a Ukrainian-specific ethnic genocide. That's a mythology that would get built. We would help develop. First time that pops up is in the 1950s. A lot of Nazi. To give you an idea, the Ukrainian nationalist organizations in the United States and in the West and Canada, some of their publications were banned because they were so overtly pro-Nazi in the 1930s.
Wow.
That's because this Ukrainian ultranationalism was really only this one region of Ukraine, this far west region, which had its own religious, political, and social history. And just by historical coincidence, ends up aligned with these fascistic elements. But because of that, that would stay a dominant trend in the post-war era, to where it was the Nazis who who originated the claim that the Soviet famine wasn't the Soviet famine, but was a Ukrainian ethnic-based genocide, in order to generate support amongst the Ukrainian nationalists for the German invasion, which they were successful in doing, but that was only in far west Ukraine. People like Bandera were unknown in eastern Ukraine until much longer after the war. But these groups recreate this in the 1950s, but it's still mostly ignored within the historical academy. In the 1980s, Ukrainian nationalists align with deep state, kind of CIA type. There's a lot of people don't realize how much book publishing is backed and financed by what I call deep state operators. You call them the national security state and intelligence operatives, call them what you will. But there are several publishing companies in Britain that were just government funded operations. That's all they were. They were CIA fronts. This is hinted at in Jean Le Carré's novel and film, The Russia House, which is quite excellent. But in the late 1980s is when we bring back the Nazi mythology of Ukrainian nationalism, which is that your real enemy are the Russians, your real enemy is the Soviets, your real enemy is them. They're the ones who deliberately targeted you because you were nationalists and committed mass genocide against you. And so they take a story that never was Ukrainian specific and make it only Ukrainian specific. That starts to seep in a little bit in the 90s. In 2003, 2004 is the first color revolution in Ukraine. The pro-Russian candidate wins. We lie and say that the election was stolen, create a huge orange color revolution in Ukraine. They take to the streets, the same Antifa type street theater we're seeing today. They've just imported the color revolution ideas we exported from groups in the United States, CIA, a lot of deep front organized groups. Some didn't know it, like the Einstein Institute still don't know that they were being used as a front, but they use a lot of their techniques to create a color revolution and get an Russian candidate elected president, and he popularizes and institutionalizes this alternative Ukrainian nationalist mythology in the form of children's books, educational books, TV shows, museums, statutes. That's where all of a sudden Stepan Bandera becomes a national figure. It's like, how did this happen? How did this guy with clearly Nazi-aligned ideas suddenly become universally popular in a whole generation of Ukrainians? To such a degree that by 2014, it's really built in. Now, of course, they're grifters, so they completely fail that president. He's utterly hated by the time he leaves office in 2010. The pro-Russian candidate who really won in 2004 is finally declared the winner in 2010. He tries to play the Russians against the EU to cut a better deal with the EU. Russia gives him a better deal, and so the moment he says he's going to do the economic deal with Russia, the reason being that Ukraine had no trade tariffs with Russia. And so consequently, they could the concern with Russia is they would close the border economically if they went into the EU, because they didn't want the EU to basically bombard their border, use Ukraine to flood Russia with EU goods without tariffs.
Right.
So that's why they cut a deal. That leads to the Maidan coup. We had been building up the neo-Nazis all the way back to the end of World War II. So they're mostly a lot of their narrative is shaped by books that we help publish, promote, and push. A lot of their ideas are ideas that were, baked out of a CIA lab room. Ukrainians don't recognize this. Like, here's an example of the mythology. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, by 1991, Ukraine is part of the Commonwealth of Independent States with Russia. There's a bunch of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. None of them are owned by Ukraine. None of them are controlled by Ukrainians. All of them are in the exclusive possession of Russia. In 1994, Ukraine decides the Commonwealth of Independent States is going to collapse, and they're going to leave the Commonwealth of Independent States. That meant Russia was taking all those nuclear weapons with them. There was no dispute about that. But before the West would recognize Ukraine outside of the Commonwealth of Independent States, required that they sign an agreement that they would the nuclear non-proliferation agreement. That is called the Budapest Accord. That later gets misconstrued in later Ukrainian history to be Ukraine had great nuclear weapons and they gave them up in exchange for security because they were always scared of Russia. That's pure mythology. It's all false, complete lies, just made up. Anybody who lived through it, as I did, knew, like, where did this come from? It came from this is part of the propaganda story that gets told.
Mhm.
And the what happens is for basically 2 decades, they drill into Ukrainians' head, your enemy is Russia, your enemy is Russia, your enemy is Russia, your enemy is Russia. So that in 2014, when they stage a Maidan coup, they have false flags. They blame the government for things that the neo-Nazis were doing. They unleash the neo-Nazi militias that we in the West had been training for about better part of a decade. Same reason the Southern Democrats use the Klan is the same reason that we use neo-Nazi militias in Ukraine. It's people get confused because it's sometimes they had prominent financiers who are also Jewish and Israeli citizens. What they don't understand is that that's just the practical reality of who they could use. Who do they trust? They don't trust Ukraine. They didn't trust Ukrainian military members to implement a deep state Western agenda. 4 out of 5 Ukrainians fought on the side of the Red Army in the World War II. There were memorials to those soldiers and troops all across Ukraine. They only trusted, who could they trust? They could trust the ultra-nationalist, neo-Nazi aligned groups who would be the most anti-Russian. And what people still don't understand is in Russia, to be a Nazi is to be anti-Russian, much more than it is to be anti-Jewish. Why? Because 4 times as many Russians died in the conflict and died in the Holocaust. That's why. So that's how they filter it. And we promoted them. They basically, as soon as the coup happens in 2014, they stage false flag events. The president has to flee Kiev, and there's rebellions, political outburst, and protest all across what you could call the Russian side of Ukraine. This was the part of Ukraine that was added in 1922 by the Soviet Union, by Lenin, which goes all the way from Odessa to Kharkiv, right along the southeastern border, along the seas of Azov and the Black Sea. And this is also, though, as you note, the resource-rich region of Ukraine. It's
Yep.
where the industry is. It's where the wheat fields are. It's where the agriculture is. It's where the oil and natural gas undeveloped depots are, or regions or reservoirs are. It's the part of the region that borders either the Sea of Azov or the Black Sea. So it has geopolitical significance. But from Odessa to Kharkiv, there's protest. In Odessa, they use the same tactics that the people in Kiev did, which was take over government buildings. What do the people in Odessa do? The militias that take over, they unleash these militias all because a bunch of national security, national territory defense, or what they're called in Ukraine, refuse to quash the protest because many of them are on the side of the protest in places like Donbass, Kharkiv, Kherson, and Odessa. So they send in the neo-Nazi militias instead. What they do in Ukraine, they lock them in the building that they're in, and light them on fire.
Yeah, I heard about that.
They sing songs cheering of it later. In the Donbass, they start shooting people in the streets. Same as in Kharkiv, same as in Kherson, same as throughout the Russian-influenced regions of Ukraine. Because going back to the 1926 census, these areas have had substantial Russian population. Odessa used to be a heavy Jewish city until World War II. And then the Nazis just killed almost everybody they could. Lviv in Western Ukraine used to be a Polish majority city until they killed them all with the help of Ukrainian nationalists in World War II. So these Russian-oriented regions rebel, massive suppression, and the hardest core pro-Russian region is the Donbass. This is a region that voted like 94, 95, 96% for the Russian-oriented presidential candidate in election after election in 2004, 2010, onward. They decide they're going to declare their independence because they have no interest in this sort of rump regime. And a civil war starts out. Ukrainian military goes in after the militias, but mostly they unleash the militias. And the way to think of it is imagine there had been, after the Civil War, a bunch of black political rebellions in the South. Who would they imagine if they sent in the Klan as their cleanup unit? That's what Ukraine did, because Ukraine didn't trust the local police force. They didn't trust the local military because a lot of them were aligned with the local population. So instead, they sent in the neo-Nazis. They sent in the sociopaths. I mean, there was groups called the Tornado Group who committed brutal assaults on young, very, very young, like 6-year-olds, that kind of thing, and videotaped it and showed it to their parents. It was
Horrible.
some of the most barbaric, I mean, to give you an idea, some of the Ukrainian Nazi units, the SS Galicia, was considered so horrifying in their conduct that even the Nazis were embarrassed by them. That gives you an idea. They tried to hold them back. They're like, that's a little insane even for us. That gives an idea for what they unleashed, what we unleashed.
Wow.
And basically, it was an insult to Russia and Russians for 8 years running. They signed an agreement with the Minsk Accords. They claim they're going to restore independent power to these regions, give meaningful independent political status, not recognize them as full republics, but give them a lot more political power to self-govern. They never honor it in 8 years and continue to commit just random tragedies. You know, they would shell bomb a school bus stop, things like this. Why? Because they wanted to provoke Russia, provoke Russia, provoke Russia. Ukraine is a tool for the West, for the deep state, for the globalists to provoke Russia because they needed Russia to invade as their political pretext to engage in globalist economic war against them. What they did not expect was that they would be losing that globalist economic war.
Yeah.
That it turns out having dollars on a screen is not as powerful as having oil under the ground or having food in the fields or having fertilizer out and about. That when you control, you are largely self-sufficient, fourth largest fisheries in the world as well in Russia. You don't need anything from the West. And if the West cuts off their BMWs and Gucci bags, so what? Ordinary Russian doesn't care. And that's really what the war is about. It's a proxy war between the globalists and Russia, a proxy war between the deep state that wants to prove its utility and line the pockets of the defense industry in the United States. Hence, we're sending them weapons we know they can't use. We're sending them weapons we know they're going to get blown up. Why? Because that justifies another check, another check, another check. And Ukraine has been we treated it like a colony, not only as a proxy war place, but that's why we set up so many biolabs there. Because we were going to experiment on them. We saw them as lesser people. We treated them the way the Nazis treated them. We treated them in part the way some parts of the Soviet Union treated them. Though the Soviet Union wasn't as bad because so many of the Soviets were Ukrainian. Whereas the Germans were a little worse. And frankly, the Americans in the West have been a little worse. That's why we didn't care that they were we made them the poorest country in Europe. All their politicians are oligarchic grifters who depend on Western aid or Western connections to the government in order to make money. This goes all the way back to the president of Ukraine after the 1990s onward, who just, by the way, just happened to pass away today. He helped put the grifter oligarchic kleptocratic machine into Ukraine.
Wow.
This is the reason why when you look at individual donors, the number one country that was the producer of individual donors to the Clinton Foundation was Ukraine. It's like, why is the poorest country in Europe the number one donors to the Clinton Foundation? This is why. This is why Zelensky doesn't care. Zelensky's a coked up actor who played a pretend president. Imagine if Alec Baldwin was made president of the United States of America tomorrow. That's what having Zelensky as president of Ukraine is. He doesn't care what happens to Ukraine or Ukrainians. He has a golden Batista style parachute that's going to land him in Miami and LA doing movie co-produced deals with Sean Penn and Angelina Jolie. And he can do all the coke he wants, and he's got hundreds of millions stashed offshore already as part of this quid pro quo, as revealed in the Panama Papers just a year or two ago. Wow. And Americans are just systematically lied to about what this war is about and what's going on.
That was a breakdown. Thank you, Robert. I just learned a lot about that whole conflict, and I'm not even surprised. I wish I was surprised.
Yeah, I know,
but I'm not. You know, it all makes sense. I just want to let everyone know, please go follow Robert. Down in the description below, you can find two of his channels, Viva's channel, which they do most of their stuff on, his own personal channel, his Twitter feed, and also the Viva Barnes Locals channel, which you can get some more content from them in the description below. Definitely give them a follow. And before we get into super chats, Robert, I just want to say thank you for joining me today. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, absolutely. Glad to be here.
Yeah, definitely. First, we got Robert Wiles for $10. Thank you, Robert. It says, I hope this makes Betty smile and Diana Francisco smile. Sorry, Adam, I didn't know I left early. Was hurting bad. Thought you missed it, but wasn't able to mail out your gift today. My mom's dog is sick. Well, that's okay, Robert. It's in no rush. I hope your mom's dog gets better. Gerald Armstrong asks, Robert, will you get Dankula on your show?
We already had him on once.
There you go.
That was the funniest guy on the planet. I mean, I can actually understand what he's saying. I don't even seen Scottish films, but I can't understand what the heck is going on. I need, the little things at the bottom. Like, supposedly they're speaking English, but with Count Dankula, he's actually speaking English. I could understand what he said. and he's just naturally funny. He'll just
Yeah.
tell one story after the next. I've never laughed more in an interview we've ever done than Count Dankula, but we'll have him on, repeatedly too. I mean, he's just one of those kind of guys.
Awesome. Bobcat says, "Hey Robert, any book recommendations today? Do you think the Inslaw affair might make it to future Hush Hush on vivabarneslaw.com?"
Yeah, that definitely is a possible. For those that don't know, the Hush Hush series is an alternative history series, either about something currently happening, might happen in the future, or has happened in the past.
Mm,
Don't always vouch for it. I just say, here's what that history would look like if I was arguing for it in a court of law.
cool.
It's a lot of fun to do. Some of them have sadly come too true. I mean, the January 6th one and the Ukrainian one.
Wow.
But the book behind me is good. Jean Le Carré, A Most Wanted Man, a good movie. Philip Seymour Hoffman. Le Carré really just describes what's really happening in the world and just disguises it as fiction, and that's what happens.
Nice. Low Watermark for 15. Thank you, Low Watermark. Says, Barnes, are you the real life Alan Shore or Denny Crane?
Mostly Alan Shore. That character is the most like what I would like to be in court. I couldn't get away with all the things he says in court without them putting me in jail. But 80% him, 20% Denny Crane. It's one of my favorite shows. Boston
Nice.
Legal.
Projects Done Poorly for $10 says, Robert, do you think I don't know, TYW SCOTUS leak was planned? I remember how the head of the DNC planned all sorts of things to do to Trump if they were going to lose the election. I think it was.
I think it's, I actually did a hush hush on the possible suspects, and I listed 3 different possible suspects. I think that the most popular one is probably going to end up true, which is that it's a liberal law clerk who saw the Supreme Court's reaction to the election cases, which is that political pressure got them to fold and not
Mm,
deal with those cases like they should have. The election fornication that took place in 2020.
yeah.
They is I think is probably the most likely explanation, but you can't rule out other alternatives, and including the idea that it was a planned distraction, including the idea that it might be someone other than a liberal law clerk that leaked it. So all of those are possibilities, but you can watch the hush hush for what some of my theories might be.
And that's on the locals page,
Yeah,
right?
the Viva Barnes Law locals.com.
Right below in the description, you could just click it. Definitely go give them a sub. Chet Chisholm says, Robert, if you guys win against the mandates, what is the hope for the overall outcome? Stop them and compensation, etc.?
One, the primary goal is to stop this from ever happening again, to get legal precedent on the books to preclude this from reoccurring. For the individuals that are suing, the goal is reinstatement and back pay. That's the economic damages hope.
Right.
For some of them that don't, that aren't as concerned with going back, they would just like a check so they can move on. But for many of them, I'm representing people against Tyson Foods who worked there for 23 years.
Wow.
These are good, hard workers, good people who want to go back to work and just have been prohibited by this absolutely ludicrous vaccine mandate that denied their religious accommodation in violation of the Constitution and the laws governing private employers, such as the Civil Rights Act. And so that's the ultimate hope for the individuals. But the broader goal is to stop it, period.
Yep. Young Pei Chang, hi Robert. Have you ever met David T. Hardy? He has quite a background, and his
Mm.
Of Arms and the Law was where I first learned about law blogging.
Interesting.
David,
I mean, I might be the name doesn't ring a bell right off the top of my head, but I may be familiar with the channel. So but yeah, I don't know him right off the top of my head.
cool. Big Floppa says, great men do not seek power. They have power thrust upon them. Commander Worf, son of Mogg. Nice.
Very
But
true.
it is true. Yep, it is true. Old Star Trek was the best Star Trek. Etienne de Gaulle for $10 says, 2 Barnes interview in one day. Did you? I guess you did another interview today.
Yeah, it was with Duran. If people want to follow geopolitical information around the world, including about Ukraine, they're both from originally Greek. You can know that they're both named Alexander, so that's a little bit of a clue. One of them lives in London, the other one lives in Greece. Alexander Macoris comes from the famous Macoris family that actually you could track it all the way back to the founding of Greek independence. I mean, so he's
Wow.
like George. So, but both of them are realpolitik guys. So they're not pro-American, they're not anti-American. They just try to give you realpolitik analysis. That leads to a more populist direction. They're skeptical of the EU and things of that nature, and skeptical of globalists for that region. But if you want good realpolitik geopolitical analysis, the Duran and their individual channels are both good. But yeah, I was on with them earlier today. That they're my favorite geopolitical channel to follow.
Nice. Yeah, I'll check them out. Robin Savi Skoglund, this is my mother, by the way, said, "What an eye-opening conversation. Great job." Thanks, Mom. Lancer says, Antifa is in lots of countries. Russia is the only one I saw hammer them. In Japan, the commie politicians will march with them as they beat people. Wow. I didn't know they were so rampant, even in Japan. That's
yeah. There's even stories that like Vice and Time did about how the Ukrainian neo-Nazis that, again, in my view, heavily funded, financed, established, founded by CIA and Western interests during the post-war, during the Cold War era,
yeah.
but continued after that. But there are stories that Vice and Time and Newsweek and other people ran about how they were internationally recruiting fellow groups to gather them throughout the world. I mean, for example, what those guys were trying to imitate in Charlottesville, they were trying to imitate the mass rallies the neo-Nazis had in Kiev, because they do massive fire torch rallies, and they're carrying signs of their SS Galicia forebears. I mean, it's not like they're hiding this stuff.
Right.
This is why Zelensky just got caught yesterday. He said, "Oh, great Ukrainian soldier," and he had a little Nazi insignia right there on his chest. So he had to take it down when people saw it, and it was like, oops, again. So that's they keep trying to hide it in ways. It's like Dr. Strangelove. They just can't. They can't trying to keep that arm down, but still can't. Help do mein Führer.
Oh, they're crazy. Matthew Hammond for 10 says, how will people push back against ESG? Can we sue publicly traded companies, or can we defang investment groups with legislation that pushes voting to individual investors or pension holders?
Both. I mean, there's a problem with, you see it in that the Orlando Police Pension Fund is suing Elon Musk to stop him from buying Twitter.
Wow.
The police don't care about that. Who is that? That's the sort of professional, liberal, woke, professional managerial class that controls so many corporate boards, so many human resource departments, so many advertising budgets, so many universities, so many governmental positions, but also so many pension investment boards, so many of these managerial Wall Street tools. They're the ones weaponizing ESG for corporations. That, and there's also a big grift going on. There's some companies that are formed that will help certify you as ESG friendly in exchange for certain money, who are investing. And some of the companies that are pushing, like your BlackRocks and others that are pushing ESG, are invested in these companies that will help certify you as ESG. Right?
Of course.
So some of this is a corporate grift. But in my view, ESG is not compliant with what is in the best interest of the stockholder. So ultimately, they are all setting themselves up for massive class actions that could lead to it. But we may need legislative reform, as the chatter suggests, as well at some point.
More red pilling for a more, like, it's just the red pill is just filtering out amongst the population. We had Gamergate, we had the parents, and like even this, like investment groups, people are being woken up to all of it. It's as I said, the silver lining of the past
that
couple
was
years.
thanks to the whole GameStop folks. I mean, they helped kind of put that on blast.
True.
That they could use the Reddit to to stop some of the hedge funds who'd been shorting popular stocks. And it increasingly woke up people to the woke manipulation of Wall Street for cultural causes that are not in their economic self-interest of the ordinary stockholder.
Toxic Man Flu for $50. Thank you very much, Toxic Man Flu. That deserves a spin of the UFO. I don't know if you recognize my UFO here, but it's not spinning fast enough. Toxic Man Flu, this is for you. Thank you very much. He says, can't wait for the first barrel of Krigler and Krigler whiskey to roll off. Appreciate you and what you do, Coffee Jesus. Thank you very much, Toxic Man Flu. I joined a show that he is the producer for yesterday, and I showed, actually have it right here. This is a 125 or 25-year-old. Actually, no, this is much older. This is from 1899. So 123 years old. This is a Krigler and Krigler whiskey bottle. And
Really?
yeah, this
So there
is a
was an actual Krigler and Krigler whiskey.
yeah,
Is
yeah.
it a family thing, family ancestry, or just
Um,
coincidence?
no, no, it's the Krigler family is quite uh sprawled out all across the country. So it's
Fascinating.
yeah, and this bottle, it says here, was selected by the Department of the Interior on July 1st, 1899, for the use at the United States Government Hospital, Washington D.C., on account of its absolute purity and fine quality. There you go. That's
There you go. That's
love that.
fantastic.
Yeah, I got all sorts of cool things. This is my favorite one here. This is a glass flask that says "Merry Christmas, Krigler and Krigler," and this is how they used to, carry around whiskey. 120.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I love that. I actually have the recipe. I was talking about it yesterday, and they're like, "You got to do it." And
Of
I
course.
I think about, well, I've got a coffee company now at Krigler Coffee, and I really love fresh coffee. It's the freshest coffee you can get. It's roasted after you order it.
Oh,
But I also am a whiskey fan, so got my eyes
yeah,
on it.
apropos.
Yeah,
You could even can't you also do, like, whiskey something, with the coffee beans too? Like, I know there's, like, bourbon something
probably.
coffee beans.
Yeah, why not? Yeah,
Yeah.
bourbon beans. Who knows? Vicidius for 20 says, in terms of the left experimenting on children, did you follow the lawsuit against LA Juvenile Facility for prescribing estrogen to juvenile offenders for behavioral disorder like oppositional disorder?
Yes.
Story
Yes. I mean,
disappeared.
really, this all started with the ADHD medications for young boys.
Yep.
You know, it was just mass medicating them and medically experimenting on them, and it just extended into the gender space. And they're doing it involuntarily. There's courts that are ordering it against parents' wishes. I mean, it's terrifying. And
It's
they're all
crazy.
going to regret it in 20 years because just the medicine is bad. A lot of the people that go through it are going to be enraged and suing lots of people in 10, 20 years.
I believe it. I believe it. Vicidius again for 10 says, during Kyle's trial, you mentioned some questions about the advisor for Rittenhouse's family. Is your opinion still the same on the man?
Yeah, I haven't changed opinion on that, but I mostly stay at it at this point. All I cared about was Kyle winning, and we were
Yep.
able to help contribute to that. And once he won, I was done with it. So there were some strategic choices I would have made differently,
Hmm.
but they didn't backfire. So I don't care at the end. I'm just glad the kid won.
Yep. Me too. Lancer says Justin Trouble, the Truth Troll, and Hard Bastard have done amazing work no one else has. Please consider having them on. They are super resource. Hmm.
Interesting titles.
Justin Trouble, the Truth Troll, and the Hard Bastard. Interesting. Are they
Yeah,
a duo, or I've never heard of them? Young Pei says, how likely is D.A. Binger to eventually be a judge? Oh, goodness.
sadly, probably not in Kenosha. He probably burned his last bridge there ultimately, but somewhere
Right.
wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah. Lancer for 10 says, I think Antifa want a globalist uh, government. If things get bad, we will have to fight globalists from different lands. Canada made a veiled threat to invade if Trump wins. In Iowa, they want to uproot all of our crops. My goodness. Well, they Antifa stated they want to burn the whole system down. I mean, when Biden won, they burnt down a Democratic office and spray painted. We don't care that, but it's not. We didn't want Biden either. We want the system to be burnt to the ground.
Yeah, the difference is, they know they'll get prosecuted if they're not doing what Biden and the Democrats want them to do. So you
True.
tend to see action, but not as aggressive action. But you're right, it's the same problem in the Ukraine neo-Nazis. What happens if these guys get real power, ultimate power, not just
Right.
over Russian dissidents within their population, but how do you control them? That's the problem. You unleash these clan types like
Hmm.
Islamic fundamentalists, sociopaths. You tend not to be able to control them over time.
True. Matthew Hammond says, should publicly traded streaming services be required to share actual streaming numbers for shows instead of just points to subscriber numbers?
Yes, but there would be nothing to stop them from faking that too by just running the streamer. They can manipulate that just as easily as anything else. So I don't know if it would fix the problem precisely.
True. Yeah, that's true. Mr. Nobody for 20 says, Mr. Barnes, you, like Thomas Sowell, are a fascinating person to listen to. What books do you suggest reading to understand the history of the Ukraine situation?
Mm. There's not really a good book itself on the topic that's comprehensive or complete.
Yeah.
Definitely not in English. There's some Russian ones that are kind of that are from the Russian perspective, but are actually more accurate, frankly, than the West. The West books are all bad. There's some original material though out there. So there's like original material on you can look up Ukrainian nationalism, myth, narrative combination. And there was a text. There was somebody who did a scholarly analysis on how we created this sort of fake Ukrainian nationalist narrative over a decade or so. You can go to, I recommend going to the CIA archive, look up Bandera, Bandera. You'll find a lot of original source materials from the 40s, 50s, and 60s about who and what he is. That can be helpful. But that's where a lot of the information is, or in contemporary commentary. Right now, there's not a good comprehensive book, unfortunately, on the subject that I know of.
Yeah. Vasidius for $50. Vasidius, thank you so much. You know what? I got to spin the UFO again. That's it. This is happening. This is for Vasidius and no one else. All right. There we go.
I heard they're doing a UFO congressional committee hearing this week, by the way.
Really?
Yeah, for the first time in like 10 years.
What is that pertaining to?
I have no idea. It's just on a congressional subcommittee hearing on unidentified flying objects.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I am instantly. I'm like, I got to listen to that. Interesting. Is it going to be public?
Yeah. I
Oh,
assume
yeah.
C-SPAN will be covering it.
Yeah. Wow. Cool. Thanks for that. That's interesting. Vasidius says that was the most decisive breakdown of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Thank you. By the way, listening to the Clinton hush hush right now, very informative.
Oh yes. Right. I grew up with the Clintons. So I worked in the White House. I delivered the White House Sunday report to Vince Foster's office the day he disappeared. The first time he wasn't there, I was like, "This is so weird." I kept knocking. He's always here.
Yeah.
Well, found out later. Supposedly he died the next day.
Yeah.
Well, he wasn't in his office on that Sunday when he was supposed to be. I'll put it that way.
Wow.
But by the way, that's how I knew Monica Lewinsky. I was an intern. All of us were interns. No intern had got a job. I was a Sunday intern. No intern had got a job since Barbara Walters with Nixon. So as soon as Monica Lewinsky got a job, we were like, Everybody in DC knew what that was about.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thurston Howell III says, would love to hear Barnes' thoughts on 2000 Mules. That will have to be for another stream because YouTube.
It's about election fornication, and it documents election fornication very well.
Yes, we'll leave it at that. Mark Peterson says, holy cow, the real ghost of Kiev, Sam Hyde, just flew over my house. Nice.
Like, a congressman actually retweeted that out.
I can't believe that.
That was my favorite thing was people were putting out photo of Supreme Court leaker found. It was Sam Hyde. They're trying to see how many people they could do it.
That's great. Aaron Behringer for $10 says, a while back, I joked about Kifu no Yuri, Ghost of Kiev manga trying to compete with the government, but now it's on order. Are you interested in seeing the translation? Interesting. Yeah, sure.
That'll be one of the ultimate false flag stories of all time. We got incubators in Gulf of Tonkin and the sinking of the Lusitania and Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain, and all those stories.
Yeah.
But the Ghost of Kiev will just is an all-time classic fake story.
It's so true.
It was one of those things, as soon as you heard it, I have like U.S. military buddies of mine who don't care about the war, but are like, that story's fake. Sorry. He didn't shoot down 47 Russian planes in the air.
Right. And culturally too, it like passed around throughout, the newer internet generation. So it's kind of like something that we all shared in our lifetimes. I wasn't alive for the Gulf of Tonkin thing, it's like that was long before I came along, but it's interesting, more red pills, it's all coming down on them. Shut up, I can cook says, hello, supporting love, listening to Barnes. Oh, supporting love, listening to Barnes. Well, thank you for supporting. I appreciate that. IFID says, James Hetfield, Barnes, and Kirk Hammett Crigler. I see your thumbnail, Adam. Man of culture and musical taste. For those who missed it, I have to show it because this is my buddy actually made it for me, and I just thought it was fantastic.
Oh, it's great. Yeah. That was Talix, our great meme maker.
Yeah.
He just makes all these great. He's the one who made this meme. I think we have like 6 great meme makers on our board, and they just do great stuff.
Yeah, I love it. And then Vasidius for 10 says, have you heard any updates on Maxwell or Epstein front? Wondering if there's news that's under the radar.
Epstein still Epstein himself. And one of the three eternal truths: Epstein didn't kill himself.
Right.
But and then Maxwell just had her sentence pulled down a little, but not in a way that matters. She's still going to get a very long sentence.
Yeah.
So her only hope is on appeal, which is remote.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, anyway,
Though I
thank you.
do think that she
Yep.
should have got a new trial because that juror clearly lied to get on the jury.
Yeah, true. Well, actually, let me ask you, what about Chauvin? Because didn't they prove that a
I
BLM
think
activist also did the same?
I think if an honest Minnesota Supreme Court, it won't be the Court of Appeals, unfortunately, there because it's too liberal, but an
Yeah.
honest Minnesota Supreme Court will take the case and will set aside the verdict on multiple grounds. Some of the things he was charged with, I don't think are crimes. What he did fits that charge just legally,
Right.
or the evidence didn't fit. And then otherwise, the intimidation of the jury and the deception to get on the jury all should be such. And they don't need to worry about consequence because he'll still be in federal prison for all his federal crimes anyway.
Right.
So, hopefully they do the right thing and clean up the law. But it's so political that that's the hurdle, not the
Yeah, true.
laws. The law's not the hurdle. The politics is.
Yep. Yep. Cougar Kitty for one. Just sending it out. Thank you very much, Cougar. I appreciate you. Robert, that was a great episode. Thank you for joining me.
Fantastic. A lot of fun.
Yeah, definitely. Everyone, thank you very much. I will be back, of course, tomorrow. It's 1/8 Wednesday. Quarter Black Garrett will be joining me. You'll have a wonderful night. Robert, have a good one.
Take care, buddy.
All right.